The story of the Ukrainian-Russian war is one of territorial ambitions, geopolitical tensions, and the human cost of conflict. It is a story that begins not in the trenches or on the front lines, but in the halls of power and the streets of protest. In February 2014, Ukraine, a nation caught between East and West, became the epicenter of a crisis that would reshape the European security landscape. At the heart of this crisis was Viktor Yanukovych, the then president of Ukraine, whose decision to reject closer ties with the European Union in favor of closer alignment with Russia ignited a firestorm of protests known as the Euromaidan. Demonstrators, many of them young people yearning for a democratic and European future, took to the streets of Kyiv and other cities, demanding Yanukovych's resignation. The protests turned violent as government forces cracked down on the demonstrators, and what began as a political crisis rapidly escalated into a full-blown revolution. Yanukovych fled to Russia, and in the ensuing power vacuum, Russia saw an opportunity to assert its influence over its neighbor. Russian troops, without insignia but clearly identifiable, took control of the Crimean Peninsula, a strategically important region with a predominantly Russian-speaking population. A hastily organized referendum, widely condemned as illegitimate by the international community, paved the way for Russia's annexation of Crimea. This annexation was not just a land grab, it was a clear violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, and a signal of Russia's willingness to use military force to achieve its geopolitical goals. However, the crisis was far from over. Emboldened by events in Crimea, pro-Russian separatists in the eastern Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, with overt support from Moscow, declared their independence from Ukraine, plunging the region into a bloody conflict. The conflict in eastern Ukraine quickly escalated into a full-blown war, with Ukrainian forces battling pro-Russian separatists armed and supported by Russia. The fighting was brutal and indiscriminate, claiming the lives of thousands of civilians and displacing countless others. The world watched in horror as images of destruction and suffering emerged from the conflict zone, a stark reminder of the human cost of geopolitical gamesmanship. In July 2014, the conflict took a chilling turn when Malaysia Airlines flight MH17, en route from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur, was shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 passengers and crew on board. International investigations concluded that the plane was shot down by a Russian-made Buk missile system, likely fired from territory controlled by pro-Russian separatists. The downing of MH17 sent shockwaves around the world, highlighting the global implications of the conflict and the urgent need for a peaceful resolution. Despite international condemnation and sanctions against Russia, the fighting in eastern Ukraine continued. In an attempt to broker a ceasefire and find a political solution, representatives from Ukraine, Russia, France and Germany met in Minsk, Belarus, in September 2014. The resulting Minsk Protocol, however, failed to stop the fighting. A second agreement, Minsk II, was signed in February 2015, but it too proved largely ineffective in ending the violence. The Minsk agreements, while flawed and ultimately unsuccessful in bringing about a lasting peace, did succeed in freezing the conflict along a static front line. This uneasy stalemate would persist for several years, with sporadic outbreaks of violence serving as a constant reminder of the fragility of the peace. However, the underlying tensions and unresolved issues that had fueled the conflict remained simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt once more. In the years that followed the Minsk agreements, the world watched as the conflict in eastern Ukraine settled into a bloody stalemate. Sporadic fighting continued, but the front lines remained largely static. However, behind the scenes, a different kind of war was being waged. A war of information, cyber attacks, and economic pressure. Russia, seeking to undermine the Ukrainian government and prevent its westward drift, engaged in a concerted campaign of disinformation and propaganda, while also providing material support to the separatists in the east. Ukraine, for its part, sought to strengthen its ties with the West, pursuing closer integration with NATO and the European Union. This only served to heighten tensions with Russia, which viewed NATO expansion as a direct threat to its security. Against this backdrop of simmering tensions and mutual mistrust, few could have predicted the events that would unfold in early 2022. On February 24, 2022, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, marking a dramatic escalation of the conflict. The invasion, which Putin attempted to justify as a special military operation aimed at denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine, was met with international condemnation and outrage. The world watched in shock and horror as Russian tanks rolled across the border, targeting major cities, including the capital, Kyiv. The invasion sent shockwaves through the international community, prompting a swift and united response from Western nations. The United States, the European Union, and their allies imposed crippling sanctions on Russia, targeting its financial institutions, oligarchs, and key industries. Military aid poured into Ukraine, bolstering its defenses and helping it to resist the Russian advance. 3 years on, the Ukraine-Russia conflict has morphed into a grinding war of attrition, a stark reminder of the human cost of geopolitical ambitions and the fragility of peace in the 21st century. The initial shock of the invasion may have faded, replaced by a numbing sense of protracted conflict, but the stakes remain high, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the future of Europe and the rules-based international order. The situation on the ground remains fluid, marked by periods of intense fighting and relative lulls. Ukrainian forces, bolstered by Western military aid and fueled by a fierce determination to defend their homeland, have managed to stall the Russian advance and even push back in some areas. However, Russia, despite suffering heavy losses, continues to occupy significant portions of eastern and southern Ukraine, relying on its superior firepower and willingness to endure casualties. As the conflict has dragged on, both sides have become increasingly entrenched, their positions hardening with each passing day. Diplomatic efforts to find a negotiated settlement have faltered, hampered by mistrust, conflicting objectives, and the absence of a clear path to peace. The Kremlin, having failed to achieve its initial military objectives, appears to be digging in for a long war, hoping to wear down Ukrainian resistance and force a negotiated settlement on its terms. The international community, while largely united in its condemnation of Russia's aggression, has struggled to find a cohesive and effective response to the crisis. The United States, under the leadership of President Trump, has adopted a more isolationist stance, questioning the value of continued support for Ukraine and calling for a negotiated settlement, even if it means concessions from Kiev. This stance has created tensions with European allies, who remain steadfast in their support for Ukraine and wary of any agreement that would reward Russian aggression.